Okay, greetings everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday school class, C.S. Lewis Beyond Narnia. It's good to be back teaching you this morning. I was off for the past 4 weeks. If you've been with us, you know that we covered the books The Great Divorce, and before that, the Screwtape Letters. Those books were covered by my co-teachers, Byron Earnhardt and Daniel Gillespie. So I'm thankful for their help with the class, but I'm excited to be back with you this morning as we look at the final book of our class on C.S. Lewis. So for this class, we have 2 more weeks to go. This morning, we're going to begin our discussion on Lewis's novel, Till We Have Faces. Next Sunday, as you can see on our schedule here, we're going to take a break for our missions conference. So we're going to have some Sunday school classes next week with our visiting missionaries giving presentations. But we will be back for the final lesson of this class the following week on August 31st, and I'm going to provide some thematic commentary on Till We Have Faces. My goal for this morning is just to cover a summary of the plot. So I'm curious, before I dive into my summary of the plot of Till We Have Faces, let me ask, how many of you have ever read Till We Have Faces before? So, okay, a handful of you, so good. Till We Have Faces is a complicated novel in many respects, but it is widely regarded as C.S. Lewis's greatest work of fiction. So you could say that we've saved the best for last. That's probably my opinion as well. I think it is the greatest of his novels. Lewis himself thought that about it. Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings, was generally not a fan of Lewis's fictional works, but he also admitted this was the greatest fictional work written by C.S. Lewis, and many literary critics would admit the same. But in many respects, it is a challenging book. Many people read this book and they're frustrated with it because they don't get what Lewis is trying to do with it. And as I attempt to narrate the plot for you this morning, you might feel a sense of confusion as well. And I gotta say that as I proceed to narrate this novel, I'm not going to be able to do it justice, because although I'm going to recount the plot to you, a lot of what makes this such a rich and profound novel is the psychological reflections within it. So this is a novel that's written in the first person by a female character named Orwell. This is the only fictional work by C.S. Lewis written from a first-person female perspective. But Lewis does a brilliant job doing it. In fact, many literary critics would say that this novel, among all of Lewis's works, has the best written female characters. And that's probably in no small part thanks to the fact that Lewis had help writing this novel from, at the time, his friend Joy Davidman, who would later become his wife, Joy Lewis. So, if you remember from the beginning of this class, I summarized a biography of C.S. Lewis, and towards the latter end of his life, he did get married, and he had 4 happy years of marriage with Joy before she passed away from cancer. But they had a friendship before they got married, and they engaged in correspondence, and she actually helped him to edit this novel. And so the final product was Lewis's writing, but she gave extensive input as he wrote it. And so the book is actually dedicated to Joy. So that said, let me also provide a little bit more background on this novel. It is a retelling of an ancient Greco-Roman myth. It's the story of Cupid and Psyche. So for those of you who know your Greco-Roman mythology, do any of you have a basic idea of the myth of Cupid and Psyche? So Cupid is the son of who? The goddess Venus, or in Greek mythology, Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Psyche, at the time, was the most beautiful woman in the world. And people were giving Psyche the adoration that Venus felt that she herself deserved, and so she was jealous of Psyche. And so she sends her son Cupid to strike her with one of his arrows so that she would fall in love with a horrid creature or some monstrous beast or something like that, so she'd spend the rest of her life in misery. But the plan backfires. She falls in love with Cupid. He falls in love with her. I'm not going to give away too much of the storyline because you're going to see this storyline unfold as Lewis retells this myth. That's what the plot of Till We Have Faces is. But Lewis is not simply repeating or regurgitating the entire myth. He's putting his own twist on it. He's changing it in some fundamental ways. But it makes it a much richer and more profound story as he does so. It's also worth mentioning that Lewis was thinking of writing this novel as early as his undergraduate years. And so if you remember the life of Lewis, he didn't actually become a Christian until his early 30s? So he was thinking of this novel even during his pre-Christian years. And interestingly, in his first thoughts on the novel, he was going to actually have it written as a complaint against the gods, which is what it is. But in the original version, he was intending the gods were going to be in the wrong, and the main character was going to be vindicated. But we're going to see that's not exactly how this story unfolds at all. So after his conversion, he had a very different perspective on God. Another thing worth mentioning as you try to make sense of what Lewis is trying to accomplish with this novel, there's a concept that I've mentioned a couple times before. If you were in the class where we covered Planet Narnia, you know, the whole theme behind the Chronicles of Narnia and their connection to like the medieval cosmology and the planets and symbolism there. A book that I used by Michael Ward, one of the chief Lewis scholars today, talks about this concept which he calls transferred classicism. That's a term that Lewis himself refers to in his own writings. Transferred classicism is relevant to understanding what Lewis is trying to accomplish in this novel as well. What that term means is when you are borrowing motifs and terminology from ancient paganism in order to communicate Christian truth. So there's going to be references to the gods, and these are pagan gods within this novel. But keep in mind that Lewis is actually trying to communicate true Christian teachings through these pagan stories. So understand these pagan divinities as, in some ways, symbolizing Christian truth. And that's going to help you make sense of what Lewis is trying to communicate here. So that is all the background commentary I'm going to give. We have 45 minutes or so, a little bit more, to try to get through the summary of this entire novel. I've tried my best to trim it down. There's just so much. It's like a little over 300 pages to read the whole thing. And I will say, in terms of the structure, most of the novel, well, it's divided into two books. Most of the novel is book one. Book two only begins with the final 50 pages of the novel. So if you can see that, if you're looking at me here, you can see the bulk of the novel is the main character, Orual, her complaint against the gods. But as you're going to see, she has a change of heart in the final pages of the novel. And so we're going to see how that story unfolds. And my goal is to try to summarize all of that for you today. So let's dive into the story, Till We Have Faces. Are you guys ready? Here we go. And again, I had some help with AI this morning, so you'll see. This was pretty fun. Here, I was able to generate a map of the kingdom of Glome. This is where the story takes place. This is a fictional ancient kingdom, which, as Lewis describes it in the novel, Glome is a barbarian kingdom, a small barbarian kingdom on the outskirts of Hellenistic civilization. So we're talking, it's BC, before the time of Christ, but we know, like, there's a reference to Socrates in there. So Socrates was what, 4th century BC? So that narrows it down to, 200 or 300 year window. It's meant to take place somewhere in that window, but this is not an actual location. I mean, if we were to try to put it on the map, it might correspond to, like, the region of, like, the Carpathian Mountains in southeastern Europe, or possibly further east into, like, Asia, the western portion of Asia. It's not exactly clear. It's not meant to map onto reality exactly. There's this fuzzy boundary between, like, our world and the world of the narrative of Till We Have Faces. But we do know that this ancient kingdom of Glome has had some, limited interaction with Greek civilization. So you're going to see the influence of Greek thought in this novel as well. But what you can see in this map, most of the action takes place in the city of Glome, which is the capital of the kingdom, which lies near this river, which is called the River Shenit, Shenit. On the other side of the Shenit, you'll find a temple to the goddess Ungit, who I'm going to mention in just a moment. And then beyond that, if you look towards the horizon there, from the city of Glome, there's a large mountain there, which is called the Gray Mountain, which is regarded as a sacred mountain. That's the mountain of the goddess Ungit and her son. So Ungit has a son who's an important figure in this novel as well. So I'm going to highlight the main characters of this novel for you before I get into the plot itself. You need to know these names. I've trimmed this down. There are several other lesser characters in the novel as well, but you need to know these names up front. As I've said previously, the main character, the narrator of the story, is Orual. She is the princess of Glome. She is the daughter of King Trom. Trom, not a good guy. He's very ill-tempered. He's very impulsive. He doesn't have very many redeeming qualities at all. And as I narrate the storyline, you're going to like him less and less. Not a good guy. But Orual is his eldest daughter. Her younger sister is Redival. And so these are the two daughters of King Trom at the beginning of the novel. And then there's another sister born, and her name in the language of Glome is Istra, but she's mostly referred to by her Greek name, Psyche. So this is where we see the ancient myth of Psyche come into play here. So she's the youngest sister of the three. There is also another character who's referred to by his nickname, the Fox. He is named at one point in the novel. His name is apparently Lycius. He is Greek, but he was captured in battle and sold as a slave to the kingdom of Glome. So he serves in the role of the tutor to the princesses. And so he educates them in Greek knowledge and philosophy. There's another character named Bardia, who is the captain of the king's guard, and he plays a central figure as one of the king's advisors in the novel. And then lastly, I've also mentioned the goddess Ungit. She is the goddess of love, which would be the equivalent of the Greek goddess Aphrodite or the Roman goddess Venus. Now, she doesn't actually have like a speaking role in the story, but she is a very important figure. She's referred to frequently throughout the novel. So these are the names you got to keep in mind as I narrate the story to you. So let's begin with chapter 1. Here you can see three of the main characters of the novel. So that's Orual on the left, and then in the middle there is her younger sister, Redival. Now, as the narrative unfolds, they're getting their heads shaved because they're in mourning, because their mother has just passed away. And so after that, the king goes and he buys a slave, and that's the figure on the right there. That is the Fox. And the king gives the Fox the task of educating his daughters. And he specifically instructs the Fox to make his daughter Orual wise, so that at least she'll have one redeeming quality. And we find out that Orual eventually does, as a young girl, discovers what that actually means. Evidently, everyone thinks that she is profoundly ugly. She is not an attractive girl at all, and she realizes this very early on. At any rate, the Fox does serve in this role in educating the girls and training them up in Greek knowledge. And the Fox is sort of a representation of like a rationalistic worldview or the ancient Greek philosophy of Stoicism, which is, conforming yourself to the order of nature. But it's a very skeptical attitude towards the gods. So the Fox doesn't actually believe in the stories about like the goddess Ungit. He thinks these are just the lies of poets. And so he's kind of communicating this worldview to the girls as well. And at this point in the story, the king decides he wants to marry again because he's really hopeful that he can have a male heir. He wants stability on the throne, and he needs a male heir to accomplish that. So he marries the daughter of a king from a neighboring kingdom, and they're only married for about a year. At the end of that year, his second wife gives birth to a child, but she dies during childbirth. And we actually are given a description of the scene of the childbirth where everyone is waiting in the hall as the wife is in her bedchamber with the king and the nurses. And so everybody is very anxious in the hall. You have the two sisters there, Orual and Redival. You have the Fox there, and you have a lot of these servants, and the priest is there, and they're offering so many sacrifices in the hall that the ground is just like covered in blood. And then there's a moment of silence, and the king walks out of the bedchamber with this very sullen look on his face, and he calls for wine. And one of the servant boys is like in a panic, so he starts walking over the flagon and the cup of wine, but he slips on the blood on the ground, and in a fit of violent rage, the king stabs him, and the servant boy dies. And then he shouts, he's furious because he says, "The gods have given me girls, I have only girls." And so he's so frustrated about that because, again, he wants a male heir to ensure stability on his throne. And his wife has just died, and he doesn't seem to care about that at all. All he cares about is the fact that he does not have the male heir he has desired. So he's about to send the fox off to the silver mines because he's throwing a tantrum, but then instead he changes his mind. He finds that the fox can be more useful in another role. The fox now serves in the role of one of the chief advisors to the king, and they work together often in what's called the pillar room. So this is where a lot of the action of the plot happens, in this pillar room, which is like the decision room, essentially. Well, the baby girl survives, and she's given the name Istra in the language of Glome, or in Greek, she's referred to as Psyche. And she is described as being the most beautiful baby. And as she matures, she is the most beautiful girl at every stage of development. And as the story unfolds, Orual and the fox and Psyche become this inseparable trio. They deeply love each other, and Orual describes this as the happiest years of her life. Whereas before that time, Orual spent most of her time with her second sister, Redival, but she kind of, at this point, after the birth of Psyche, goes off and she does her own thing. She kind of becomes more interested in boys at this point, or in gossip. And the fox, as Psyche grows older, the fox comments that this is a beautiful girl. She is even prettier than Aphrodite, or, in the religion of Glome, the goddess Ungit. And that seems to be a dangerous thing to say, because people recognize that you don't want to take the adoration due to the goddess Ungit and give it to a mere mortal. But that seems to be what people do on a regular basis as Psyche gets older. Well, as the story unfolds, yes, as I mentioned, Redival, she kind of goes off and does her own thing, and she has one relationship after another. At one point, she begins a romance with this young man named Taran, but then the king finds out about it, and he's furious. He actually has his men castrate the young man, Taran. But that just leads to a series of troubles for the entire kingdom. You have one bad harvest after another. Then there's an uprising in the kingdom, because it turns out that Taran was the son of a very influential nobleman. And so there was this rebellion led against the king. The king wins, but barely. His kingdom is profoundly weakened after that point, so he's under constant threat by neighboring kingdoms. At one point in the story, there's this pregnant woman from the city who approaches Psyche with the sisters and asks Psyche to bless her child. And the other older sisters are very confused, like, Psyche, what's going on? Why did this peasant lady just ask you to bless their child? And Psyche says, oh, well, this happens all the time. Just random peasant people come up to me and ask me to bless them. And they come to find out that the people of Glome treat Psyche as if she's a goddess. She is so beautiful that, like, people are tempted to worship her. But things continue to get worse. A plague breaks out in the city, and people are hit with this fever, which is sometimes lethal. And so at one point, you have the crowds of the peasants calling out for Psyche because they think that Psyche has healing powers. And so she passes through the crowds of the city, and they think that the mere touch of her will heal them. Well, that doesn't actually happen. Instead, what happens is Psyche herself gets sick. But thankfully, she recovers. But as it turns out, when she recovers from this fever, she's more beautiful than ever, if you can imagine that. But the sickness itself continues for a time. So does famine, and so does plague and drought. The river Shennet near the city dries up. And so people are thinking that the kingdom is now cursed. So rather than referring to Psyche as the blessed one, people are coming to realize maybe she's actually a curse upon us. And they refer to her as the accursed one. Well, eventually the plague runs its course. It begins to subside, and the people who got sick with it and survived, they begin to recover. One of whom is the priest of Ungit, who comes to visit the palace himself with a warning to the king. So it turns out that this priest, who's now old and blind and thin, he arrives with a message for the king. So he comes from the temple to the palace. He says that he has had a meeting with the people of the kingdom without the king's knowledge, and the king is furious about this. And the priest says that the land is now cursed, and in fact, there's rumor that the Brute has returned, this mysterious figure called the Brute, or the Shadow Brute, who lives near the Gray Mountain and sometimes, hunts the livestock and perhaps occasionally even the people of Glome. And so the priest says that a sacrifice must be made to the Brute. And it said that this brute, it could be either Ungit herself or perhaps Ungit's son, the god of the Grey Mountain, or perhaps mysteriously he's even both. The gods are very mysterious like that. And he warns that whatever sacrifice is given to the brute is either going to be devoured by Ungit herself or wedded to Ungit's son. Or perhaps these two things are the same thing. So in this novel, the love of Ungit is described as being a devouring love. So to love and to devour are the same thing for the gods, as Orwell frequently complains. So this offering, whoever it's going to be, must be chained to the holy tree, which is located on one of the slopes of the Grey Mountain. And the priest says that the people with him had cast lots to identify who is this accursed one. And at first the king is in a panic because he thinks, uh-oh, what if it's me? And so he's very nervous as the priest starts telling him all this. But then he comes to find out, no, it's not the king. It's actually his daughter, Psyche. The lots showed that she is the accursed one. And so you can see the king, he's experiencing a sense of relief, but he's trying to put on a show that, oh, my poor daughter, I guess, I have to do my duty as the king. I mean, to save my people, I'm going to have to sacrifice her. But Orwell can see right through the king. She recognizes that her father does not care one fig for his daughter Psyche. And so, Orwell grabs onto the king, begging and pleading, don't sacrifice my sister, the one person I love most in the world. And then the king throws her off violently, and so she badly injures herself to the point that she actually loses consciousness. Well, then she's revived by the king, who's now helping her gently. He's feigning gentleness. He helps her to sit in a chair. He offers her some wine, and he talks to her gently, saying, now, my child, women shouldn't talk back to their fathers that way. Very patronizing to her. But then the priest explains that Psyche, or the king explains this, Psyche is going to be sacrificed the very next day. And at this point, Orwell says, Father, don't do it. Take me instead. I'll offer myself to the brute if necessary, but don't hurt Psyche. And then the king kind of scoffs at her and stands her next to a mirror. This is not an AI-generated image, by the way. This is actually cover art from one of the books of Till We Have Faces. The king stands Orwell in front of the mirror and says, ha, really? You would have me sacrifice that instead? Again, mocking the fact that she is not an attractive girl. And so at this point, Orwell leaves the pillar room. And she encounters her sister Redival, who is worried that they're all going to be sacrificed because they're all daughters of the king. And Orwell is furious, thinking, Redival, again, you're just thinking about yourself. If and when I ever become queen, one of the first things I'll do is have you executed. And so Redival is horrified and runs off in tears. Because Orwell blames Redival for having spread word of Psyche to the house of Ungit. So in her own way, Orwell is blaming Redival for the fact that Psyche now has to be the offering to the brute. At this point, Orwell goes into Psyche's tower room where she's being held prisoner for the night before the sacrifice. And she persuades Bardia. Remember who Bardia is. He's the captain of the king's guard. And he's the one guarding the room with Psyche. Orwell persuades Bardia to let her in against the king's orders so that she can have one final conversation with her sister. And so she enters in. But ironically, it's not Orwell who comes to comfort Psyche. It's Psyche who's comforting Orwell. So Psyche's there sitting on the bed with an oil lamp burning next to her. And strangely, though, Psyche seems to be at peace with the situation. In fact, she even expresses a sense of hopefulness about her own death. Now, it's not that she's suicidal by any means, but there is a profound longing within her that she thinks will be fulfilled through this sacrifice, whatever may happen, whether she becomes wedded to Ungit's son or devoured by Ungit herself. But she says it's not a suicidal thought by any means. Rather, she says, it was when I was happiest that I longed most. It was on happy days when we three, so that was Orwell, Psyche, and the fox, were up there on the hills, the three of us, with the wind and the sunshine, where you couldn't see Glome or the palace. Do you remember? The color and the smell. And looking across at the Grey Mountain in the distance. And because it was so beautiful, it set me longing, always longing. Somewhere else there must be more of it. Everything seemed to be saying, Psyche, come. But I couldn't, not yet, come. And I didn't know where I was to come to. It almost hurt me. I felt like a bird in a cage when the other birds of its kind are flying home. You might recall from previous lessons of mine on C.S. Lewis the concept of Sehnsucht. Remember, that's the German word that Lewis uses. Sometimes he just translated it as joy with a capital J. Like think of his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. Joy is this deep longing. It's not simply happiness. Rather, it's this mixture of homesickness and nostalgia and a longing for something that cannot be fulfilled in this earth. The desires of this world awaken that longing, but they cannot fulfill that longing. And so Psyche herself has experienced this feeling of capital J joy, or Sehnsucht. And that's what we read about here. But at this point, Orwell goes back to her bed, and she's sore all over from the injuries from her dad. She wakes up very early before dawn to try to catch up with the procession that's leading Psyche to her sacrifice on the slopes of the Gray Mountain. But she can't even make it. Like she herself is so worn down. She sees Psyche with a painted face, in the procession, marching away from her. She tries to catch up, but she falls down the stairs, nearly unconscious. And so her servants take her back to her bed, where she's like in this delirium. And she cannot accompany the procession to the sacrifice. So she's in bed for several days. And she's reflecting on just how cruel the gods are to her. And she expresses these words: the nearest thing we have to a defense against them, the gods, but there is no real defense, is to be very wide awake and sober and hard at work to hear no music, never to look at earth or sky, and above all, to love no one. Because she thinks that the gods take advantage of our longings and our loves only to burst our bubble. And so she thinks that the gods are even sadistic in this way, that they take pleasure in tormenting us in our delights and in our loves. And so she says, we have to learn to close off our hearts. But she remains in bed for several days. And she has like these fits of dreaming and delirium. But when she finally awakes, it's raining outside. The plague has subsided. The drought has subsided. The crops of the kingdom are mostly lost, but the gardens start growing again. And even some of the livestock has been recovered. And the neighboring kingdom of Fars, which was one of the biggest threats to the kingdom of Glome, to their south, it's now finding itself in civil war, so it's no longer a threat to the kingdom. And so Orual asks the fox, is this actually proof of the existence of Umgit? Because it looks like the sacrifice worked. The fox responds, no, this is merely due to chance or perhaps nature, but we can still take comfort in what happened, because our comfort is that the evil is entirely theirs, like the king and the priests and all them. It's not ours. We were blameless through this entire ordeal, and even Psyche herself died with virtue. And so we can take comfort in that. So again, the fox is reflecting good Stoic Greek philosophy. But at this point, Orual decides that she must travel to the Gray Mountain, to the location of the sacrifice, so that she can recover the remains of Psyche from the holy tree that she had been chained to for the sacrifice, so that she can burn or bury whatever remains there are of Psyche. So at this point, Orual, she comes up with this decision, but she's reluctant to undertake the journey because she realizes that once she accomplishes this task, she has nothing else to look forward to, nothing else to live for afterward. And so she's putting it off for a time. And during this time, Bardia, again, the captain of the guard, begins training Orual in sword fighting. And it turns out she's remarkably gifted in sword fighting. And I think at one point Bardia even says, it's a shame that you weren't born a man, which was meant as a compliment, although Orual, of course, doesn't quite see it that way. But it's the closest thing to a compliment that she has received. And so at this point, Bardia himself offers to take Orual up to the Gray Mountain so she can accomplish this task that she's resolved to do. And the journey itself is beautiful. Orual says it's even enough to make her heart dance. But she's guarding herself again because she remembers that these are the moments when the gods like to burst our bubble the most. So she's not going to allow herself to delight in this beauty as they approach the Gray Mountain. But they come to the site of the sacrifice, the tree, and they don't see any remains of Psyche. They see the chain that she was tied up to. They even find her ruby sandal nearby, but there's no sign of Psyche. But then what happens? They cross beyond the location of the sacrifice. There's like this saddle to the mountain beyond the slope where the sacrificial tree is located. Beyond that slope, they see a beautiful green valley with a river running in the midst of it. They approach the river, and who should they see on the other side of the river? Psyche herself. And she seems to be happier than ever. She's laughing. She's joyful. She looks healthy. She's tan. She's wearing rags for some reason, but it looks like she's in perfectly good health. And so Orual comes to Psyche, and Psyche gives her some berries and this fresh mountain water from her cupped hands, and she calls this wine. And so at this point, Psyche tells Orual the story of her sacrifice and what happens. She talks about how after the whole ceremony, she was left alone, chained to that holy tree. And for a time, nothing happened. Animals approached her, but then they left. And then in the silence, the god of the west wind finally came to her and freed her. And this god of the west wind filled Psyche with this sense of shame in her own mortality. She's in the presence of this transcendent being, but she feels so small and unworthy in the presence of a god. But the god of the west wind then takes Psyche into this valley, into a palace where she hears these invisible spiritual voices telling her to enter her house. So this is to be her palace. And Psyche, inside the palace, prepares for the arrival of her bridegroom, who is the god of the gray mountain. And so at this point, Psyche says that she wants to take Orual inside her palace and show her around the palace too, so she can see where she's been living this entire time. And Orual says, okay, so where is the palace? And Psyche says, what are you talking about? We're standing in the courtyard right now. And then Orual is filled with this sense of shock and horror, like, what are you talking about? We're in the middle of a valley. I see woods, I see river, but there's no palace here. And then things take a turn for the worse. This is the moment of Orual's chief charge against the gods. Psyche believes they're standing in her palace. And she even believes that she gave Orual a real cup of real wine when all Orual saw was Psyche cupping her hands and giving her like mountain water and berries. So at this point, Orual becomes convinced that Psyche must have gone mad. She has no idea what's going on in the mind of her sister. And so she demands to know, Psyche, who is this bridegroom that you're talking about? But Psyche says, well, I'm not actually allowed to see his face. He only comes to me at night. So as the story goes, and this is what the original Greek myth says as well. So when Cupid would visit Psyche, it would only be at night. They'd come together as husband and wife. And they were both profoundly in love with each other, but there was one rule that Cupid gave to Psyche, which is she was never allowed to see his face. So he only came to her in the darkness, and then he would leave in the morning before the break of dawn. And so Orual, of course, cannot believe this story. She's not convinced of it at all. But there are some unresolved questions here. Like, exactly how has Psyche managed to stay so healthy all this time? How was she able to be freed from the tree? So there are some questions that are left unexplained if Psyche is merely mad. At this point, it starts to rain, and Orual can see the raindrops falling on Psyche, although Psyche herself doesn't think that they're even getting hit by the rain at all, because she thinks they're indoors. At this point, Orual tries to compel Psyche to come back with her, but of course Psyche refuses, saying, I can't obey you anymore, sister. I have someone else to obey now. I have a husband. I'm a wife now. So at this point, Psyche sends Orual away, but predicts that they will again, at some point soon, meet again. So Orual goes back to the encampment that Bardia has made for them on the slopes of the Gray Mountain, and she explains what Psyche had said to her, and Bardia himself is very confused. And so at this point in the day, it's too late for them to make the return all the way back to Glome, so they have to stay overnight in the encampment that they've made. Bardia himself goes to sleep, but Orual can't go to sleep. So this is, during the twilight hour, she decides to get up and she walks back towards the river. And she looks across the river and it's covered in mist. But then she looks through the mist and she can catch a glimpse of something. For a single solitary moment, she can see a massive, beautiful gray palace with its arches and with its pillars. And it's this magnificent sight, but it only lasts for a moment. And then the palace vanishes. And she wonders, what was that? Was that a hallucination? Was that real? She couldn't tell. She returns back to the camp, but she never tells anyone ever about that glimpse of the gray palace. She keeps that as a secret to herself. She doesn't tell Bardia, she doesn't tell the fox, doesn't tell Redival or anyone else. At this point, the next day, Orual and Bardia make the journey back to Glome, and Orual tells Bardia the whole story of what happened, minus the palace, to Bardia. But Bardia himself doesn't think that Psyche has gone crazy. Rather, he thinks that she's been taken in by the brute, who must be this horrible demon, like a malevolent deity of some kind. So Bardia believes in the gods, but he also recognizes that some gods are evil, and perhaps Psyche has been tricked by one of the evil gods. So Orual, after the return home, she resolves to return to Psyche at some point to get Psyche out of there by any means necessary, even if that means killing Psyche, because she recognizes the danger that Psyche is in. So back at the palace, Orual tells the same story to the fox, again, minus the vision of the gray palace. The fox has a different interpretation of what happens. Again, he doesn't think Psyche has gone mad, but he thinks that Psyche's husband must be some common thief or a vagabond who's been living in the mountain, who freed her and has duped her and persuaded her to think that he's a god who will only visit her by night. They both, the fox and Orual, they agree to go back to Psyche while the king is away on a lion hunt. So he's away for the next few days, so this is the perfect time for them to go back to Psyche. But they can't agree on a plan on how to persuade Psyche to leave her new husband. And so at this point in the conversation, the fox just gets too tired, so he decides to go to bed. Orual is frustrated with the fox at this point. Like, how can this not be priority one for you? How can you think about sleeping at a time like this? But the fox goes off to bed. And so Orual is frustrated, so she goes to see Bardia and asks him to take her back to the Gray Mountain. But Bardia can't do the journey because the king has ordered him to stay at the palace while the king's away on this lion hunt. But Bardia offers to have his soldier named Graham, who's like one of his trusted lieutenants, to accompany Orual on the trip back to the Gray Mountain, to the valley of the god beyond the Gray Mountain. So Orual and Graham, they make this trip back to the valley where Psyche is located. And so Orual tells Psyche that her husband is not a god. Both Bardia and the fox agree on this, and these are two trustworthy sources. And so she's trying to persuade Psyche to give up this relationship because her husband is not a god as he claims to be. But Psyche refuses to accept this. She says, if only you could meet my husband, you would see how deeply he loves me and how true he is. But Orual says, well, if he's really a god, then why is he refusing to let you see his face? So Orual has an idea. She has a plan. She tells Psyche to light an oil lamp that she has brought with her at night so that she can look upon the face of her husband. And of course, Psyche refuses to do this because this is the one rule that her husband had given her. You cannot look upon the face of this god because, he doesn't even give a reason to Psyche. He just says, you cannot do it. At this point, though, Orual is desperate. She has to find some way of getting Psyche away from whoever this creature is that claims to be her husband. So she pulls out a dagger, and she actually stabs herself through the arm, threatening to kill herself if Psyche doesn't do this, to light the oil lamp at night to see the face of her husband. Psyche is deeply grieved by this because essentially this is emotional blackmail, isn't it? She's exploiting Psyche's love for Orual in order to get Psyche to disobey the one commandment her husband gave her. So Orual is using Psyche's love for her as a weapon against her. So very reluctantly, Psyche agrees to do this, but she says something has now died between them. There's going to be a wall between them that can never be repaired. And she's going to hope that her husband can forgive her and show her a truer love than the cruel love that Orual has shown her. So night falls. Orual goes back to her camp where, the soldier Graham is waiting as well. She, in the middle of the night, she looks into the distance beyond the river to see is Psyche obeying her instructions. She sees the dim light of an oil lamp lit, and then all chaos breaks out. It's at this point where the entire valley is just overwhelmed in thunder and lightning and earthquake. Everything turns into chaos. And at one moment, Orual hears two voices, but she can't make out their words. The one is this majestic golden voice, and the other voice is the sound of a woman weeping and running away. And then at this point, the entire valley is destroyed with thunder, lightning, flooding, and landslides. But then there's this one solid, enduring light right in front of Orual. And in the midst of that bright, enduring light, Orual sees the appearance of a glorious, beautiful man. It was a god, after all. And these are the only words that the gods speak directly to Psyche. The god says these words to Psyche. Psyche goes out in exile. Now she must hunger and thirst and tread hard roads. Those against whom I cannot fight must do their will upon her. You, woman, shall know yourself and your work. You also shall be Psyche. So at this point, Orwell realizes the gods are real, and they hate her, and they're going to punish her for what she's done. And she resents the gods for that. Why couldn't they have made themselves clearer to her? Why couldn't they have made it obvious to her that it was all true, that Psyche was right? And so she leaves hurt and grieving that she will never be reunited with her sister. Her sister has gone off into exile, but she has to bear the grief of her sister as well this entire time, knowing that she brought this upon her sister. And so she returns back to the palace before the king returns from his lion hunt. Orwell tells the fox the entire story of what happened, minus the fact that she threatened herself with the dagger and minus the fact that she saw a god. She does mention how she gave the oil lamp to Psyche and persuaded Psyche to look upon the face of her husband at night. The fox asks Orwell, how did you manage to persuade Psyche to do that? But Orwell cannot bring herself to say it because she knows the fox would strongly disapprove of her having used, emotional blackmail as a weapon against her sister. So the fox, though, thankfully lets Orwell keep her secret, and Orwell won't tell him how she was able to persuade Psyche. But from then on, from this point in the story to the end of the story, Orwell decides to always wear a veil. For the rest of her life, everywhere she goes, no one will ever again see her face. She is always completely veiled. At this point in the story, the king returns from the lion's hunt. He sees Orwell wearing her vase. He tells her to take it off, but she refuses. It's almost like a dare, like dare me to. And the king agrees to go along with it. And at this point, she realizes that the king is no longer someone to be afraid of. She, at this point, never again does she fear her father for his temper tantrums, for his murderous rage. She doesn't care anymore. Because at this point, she knows the gods might strike her dead at any moment for what she's done. So she's basically resigned herself to the fact that she might die at any point. So nothing really causes her fear anymore, least of all her father. Many days pass, but then Orwell, she comes to realize, well, maybe the gods are not going to kill her after all. Maybe her fate is going to be worse. Maybe they're going to condemn her to life. So she has to carry this sorrow with her for perhaps years and decades for the rest of her life. So what does Orwell do? She decides to reset Psyche's room as it was before all of their troubles began. The king, he returns home one night after partying at one of his noble's house. This is in the middle of winter, and so he's a bit drunk. He slips on the stairs. He breaks his thigh, and he's bedridden. And it looks like this might actually do him in. There's no healing this injury. It looks like he may die of the infection. At this point, Orwell visits him in his bed. He looks upon Orwell wearing her veil, and he is utterly horrified at what he sees, the veil. He says, I know who you really are. He doesn't think it's his daughter. He calls for Orwell. He calls for the fox. He calls for Bardia. I know who you really are. He has this look of terror. We're not told who he thinks it is, but we're led to believe perhaps he thinks this is the goddess Ungit, who's coming to judge him. And so at this point also, coincidentally, the priest of Ungit is on his deathbed, and he's to be succeeded by another younger priest named Arnhem. And so this is actually an opportunity for a new alliance to form between the kingdom of Glome and the priesthood, so between Orwell and Arnhem. So the advisors, they recognize that the king is on his deathbed, and Orwell any minute now could become the queen. So the fox and Bardia come and they congratulate her. After this, Orwell is by herself in the great hall, and in the silence, she thinks she can hear the sound of a girl weeping outside. She goes outside to find the source of the sound because she's wondering, could it be Psyche? Could Psyche have returned? But she finds the weeping, it's really just the sound of the chains of a well swinging in the breeze. And this is a sound that would haunt her day after day. But then when she's in the courtyard with the well, she sees a dark figure hiding behind the bushes. And who does it turn out to be? It turns out to be Prince Trunia, one of the sons of the king of Fars, the neighboring kingdom to the south. And she's fully veiled, and she's holding up a dagger at this guy, But this Prince Trunia actually starts flirting with her. He doesn't know what she looks like, and Orwell has never had anyone flirt with her before. It's a very odd experience. But here's what we learn from the prince. A civil war has broken out in the kingdom of Fars between Trunia and his older brother Argan. Trunia got caught in a skirmish nearby, but escaped into Glome with a sprained ankle. So he's not going anywhere. But Argon, the brother, and his troops are on the way to Glome to demand Trunia be handed over to them so he can be killed to secure Argon's position on the throne. Orwell instead decides to take Trunia as a prisoner, but promises she'll do anything short of open warfare with Fars, which the kingdom of Glome can't afford at this point, in order to keep Trunia safe. So Orwell comes up with a brilliant idea. She challenges Argon to single combat and says that if she wins the combat, then Trunia goes free. On the other hand, if Argon wins, then Trunia will be handed over to him. But either way, the forces of Fars will leave the kingdom of Glome, and so everyone wins. Orwell at this point returns to the king's bedroom one more time and sees the look of the king looking at her, and he's utterly terrified again. And at this point, Orwell realizes that even if the king miraculously survives this, he'll never be the same. He's going to be insane, and he'll be harmless. And so Orwell sleeps soundly that night. Next day, a herald arrives from Prince Argon and the troops of Fars. Argon has given the message that he's accepted the challenge. And the new priest, the junior priest Arnhem, arrives with news that the old priest has died. So this younger priest has now succeeded to the priesthood of the Temple of Ungit. And as Orwell reflects on this upcoming duel, she decides there's one last thing she needs to do before she potentially goes to her death. She decides to free the fox. He spent his entire adult life as a slave, serving as a tutor to Orwell and her younger sister Redival. Now he's free. And so the fox leaves at this point and wonders, what is he going to do now that he's free? Can he return to Greece? He can do whatever he wants with his life now. And Orwell, after he leaves, is initially grieved at the thought of the fox leaving her, because this is one of the few people in life that she truly loves and who loved her back. But soon the fox returns to her and says he's decided to stay, and she weeps for joy because he is one of the last loves in her life. The next day, Orwell speaks with Trunia about the planned duel, but she doesn't tell him who's going to be the fighter on his behalf. And then Redival, the sister, arrives to meet Trunia. And at this point, Trunia has an idea, because remember, Redival, she's not as beautiful as Psyche, but she's a pretty girl. Trunia suggests that if he survives this whole situation, perhaps he could marry Redival and form an alliance between the kingdoms of Glome and Fars. At this point, Orwell, the fox, and Bardia, they go into the armory to find the right armor for Orwell to wear for the combat when they receive news that the king has finally died. So then the next day, what happens? Orwell marches through the city with crowds cheering for her because they love a good spectacle. It's not like they even know anything about her yet. She's just assumed the throne. Orwell approaches the battlefield, and after some ceremony and discussions and preparations between the opposing sides, the duel begins. The fight does not last very long before both Orwell and Argon realize she has him outmatched. Because she's been training with Bardia for the years, she's so much better at a sword than he is. And soon enough, she gives a lethal stab to his inner leg that he doesn't recover from, and he dies. So she emerges victorious from this duel. There's a feast in the hall that evening, and Bardia, during the feast, requests that he leave early because he has just received news that his wife is in labor. And at this point, Orwell realizes how much she resents Bardia's wife because she keeps stealing his time from her, Orwell, but he reluctantly dismisses him. So yes, of course, you can be home for the birth of your child. Later that night, alone, and after too many drinks herself, Orwell realizes that she is now queen, and from that moment forward, she decides to do what she can to put to death the old Orwell, so she will assume the role as queen. And then we get a recounting of all of her achievements as queen. She has a very long reign. At one point it says it's about 40-year-long reign. Glome has experienced success militarily, politically, administratively, economically. There are myths about the veiled queen, some of them partly true, but Orwell admits that many of these myths are exaggerated. But at one point she does admit it's true that there was a battle where she single-handedly killed 7 of the enemies and rescued Bardia. But she is constantly, as I mentioned earlier, tormented by the sound of the chains clanking in the breeze in the palace well. These chains constantly remind her of the sound of a weeping girl, which reminds her of her sister Psyche. So what does she decide to do? She builds these thick stone walls around it to muffle the sound so she can no longer hear these chains that remind her of her sister. She tries to bury the memory of Psyche and just devotes herself to being queen and all the responsibilities of being queen. But day after day, it seems like this endless repetition. It almost sounds like, Ecclesiastes as she describes this. Nothing new under the sun. It's all vanity. Eventually, the fox himself, who was already old, he passes away and he's buried with honors. At this point in the story, it is near the end of the queen's reign, and she decides there's one more thing she would like to do before she passes away. She wants to go on a journey. She wants to visit the neighboring kingdoms surrounding Glome. So she and her entourage, they travel to Fars, the kingdom to the south, where she sees her sister many years later, who is now old and fat. They reach an agreement where Redival's second son, Darin, is going to be the heir to the throne because Orwell herself has never married. So Orwell's nephew will be destined to be king of Glome after she passes away. From Fars, Orwell travels westward to the kingdom of Assur. And after visiting a famous hot spring there, Orwell walks further into the woods where she sees a small a temple with an altar in front of it. And on that altar, there's a small statue of a beautiful girl covered with a black veil, like the opposite of Orwell herself, who's wearing a white veil at this point. The priest of this little temple asks Orwell if she wants to hear the sacred story of the goddess Istra. Remember what Istra is? That was actually the name of Psyche in the language of Glome. There's a mythology that's emerged about a goddess named Istra. And so the priest tells the story about how she was the youngest and most beautiful of the king's 3 daughters. And at one point she was taken to the palace of a goddess's son to wed him. And the god only visits her at night, but she's not allowed to see him. Orwell realizes this is the exact story of her sister. It's now been turned into a religious mythology in this neighboring kingdom. And it's said in the story that the priest is telling that Istra's sisters visited her palace and they became jealous of her. And wait, Orwell interrupts the priest and says, wait, the sisters can see the palace? That's not right. But Orwell says, I'm just telling the story here. This is how the story goes. They saw the palace, they were jealous of their sister, and they persuaded her by appealing to her sense of curiosity to light a lamp at night to see the face of her husband. And she does it, breaks the commandment of her husband, and Istra is then sent into exile weeping. But now she must complete a series of tasks given to her by the goddess, the father of this god, before she can ever be reunited with her divine husband, the goddess's son, and thereby become a goddess herself. That's a new part of the story for Orwell. Wait a minute. She has an opportunity to be reunited with her husband. Does it happen? Does she become a goddess? She has all these questions, but the priest is like, this is just the sacred story. I'm just telling you the story. Orwell is frustrated, though, by the inaccuracies of the story. Jealous? It wasn't jealousy that made me do this to my sister. Of course, she won't admit to the priest that this is her story or her sister's story. But it wasn't jealousy that drove her to do it. It was the hiddenness of the gods. The fact that the gods would not appear to her clearly. So the gods frustrated Orwell by making her guess and then punished her for guessing wrong. That's what infuriated her. That's what drove her to do what she did. At this point, Orwell resolves to write a book of her complaint against the gods. And so at the conclusion of book 1, she says these words: I say the gods deal very unrightly with us, for they will neither, which would be best of all, go away and leave us to live our own short days to ourselves, nor will they show themselves openly and tell us what they would have us do, for that too would be endurable. But to hint and hover, to draw near us in dreams and oracles, or in a waking vision that vanishes as soon as seen, to be dead silent when we question them and then glide back and whisper words we cannot understand in our eyes when we most wish to be free of them, and to show to one what they hide from another. What is all this but cat and mouse play, blind man's buff, and mere jugglery? Why must holy places be dark places? So she's expressing her frustration that the gods have basically been playing games with her and led her into this misery. It's their fault. That leads us into book 2. What do you think? Can we keep going? Okay, we'll keep going because this is where the change happens. This is how the story concludes. This is where she undergoes her character transformation. Orwell returns home from her journey and gets news that Bardia is very sick. At this point, there's an embassy arrives from the great king. There's some greater empire or kingdom beyond the region of Glome. And the embassy is led by the chief eunuch of the king. Orwell immediately, soon recognizes who this eunuch is. It was Taryn. Do you remember from the beginning of the story, like her sister Redival had the relationship with the young man, and the king had that boy castrated? He has now become the greatest, most powerful person in the neighboring empire of the great king. And he tells the story of what happened between him and Redival. Taryn, at this point in his life, has become wildly successful, but he recalls how Redival, when he first met her, had been so lonely. And she had been hurt. She felt rejected by her sister, Orwell. Orwell realizes at this point she had never before considered Redival's feelings about her. She always despised her sister because of her apparent foolishness, but she had never considered the possibility that she herself had perhaps hurt her sister. That once Psyche was born and she spent all her time with the fox and Psyche, Redival felt ignored and rejected. At this point, Orwell starts having very bizarre dreams. She has a dream where she becomes an ant, and she starts sorting different kinds of seeds into piles. So like a pile of wheat or barley, and so forth, rye. At this point in the story, Bardia finally dies. One of her chief advisors, there are only two people in life that she's been close to after the exile of Psyche, the fox and Bardia. It's at this point, though, that Orwell grieves because she realizes that she never told Bardia that she loved him. At this point, Orwell visits Bardia's widow, who's named Ansit, and Orwell and Bardia's wife, they've always had this tension. They don't like each other. They've always kind of been bitter towards one another. At this point, Ansit is honest with Orwell. She says that the queen has overworked Bardia over the years and led him to an early grave because she was always demanding his time, and Ansit only had the leftovers of her husband. Orwell at this point says, "What, are you jealous of me? Are you jealous that I might have stolen your husband's love?" She pulls off her veil. Remember, she has gone veiled this entire time for decades. She shows her true face to say, "Look, you think I was a threat to the love of your husband?" But then Ansit looks at her face. She's not repelled. What she sees is a woman who's grieving. And Bardia's wife says, "Oh, I never realized before. You loved him too." And they start weeping together over this shared loss. And so at this point, Orwell realizes that her love for Bardia was a devouring love. It was a selfish love. It was a possessive love, just like Ungit. And at this point, Orwell says this was the beginning of her divine surgery. Time passes, and there's the ceremony of the new year where Orwell has to sit in the house of Ungit, the temple of Ungit, with the priest for this ritual to usher in the new year. And while she's sitting, Orwell sees a statue of the goddess Ungit, which is this dark stone covered with blood stains. And it's this grotesque figure. After the ceremony, Orwell goes back to her bedchamber, where she sees a vision of her father, the king, Trom, who says, "Get up, girl," orders her to dig through the ground deeper and deeper into to the depths of the earth. Orwell finds herself in this room deep below the earth where the king shows her a mirror. When Orwell looks into the mirror, she actually sees the face of Ungit staring back at her, and the king asks her, "Who is Ungit?" And Orwell says, "I am Ungit." At this point, Orwell wakes up. She's suicidal at this point. She's so overcome with grief and sorrow for her life. But she's too weak to draw a sword on herself. So she goes to the river Shennet at night to try to throw herself in, but she hears a voice saying, "Don't do it. Before you die, you must die." And she returns to her chamber. Orwell reflects, well, perhaps being Ungit means having an ugly soul. And just as it takes physical beauty to win men, perhaps it takes the beauty of a soul to win the gods. But what if you're born with an ugly soul? What do you do then? Then she has another vision, this time when she's wide awake. She's standing on a riverbank where there's a flock of rams that are covered in beautiful golden fleece. And just a handful of their fleece would be enough to make one as wealthy as a king. But as Orwell approaches the rams, they form a stampede and they trample over her. But while Orwell's lying on the ground, she looks up and she sees a beautiful woman plucking the golden fleece from the hedges beyond the rams. The vision ends. More time passes. Orwell continues to pass wise judgments, but she doesn't care. She comforts herself in the knowledge that at least her love of Psyche was pure. Then she has another vision. She has to cross a desert holding a bowl. I'm going to try and go quickly here, sorry. She has to fill this bowl with water from the river of the Deadlands and bring it to the goddess Ungit. And so she has to traverse this desert, which seems like to last for over 100 years in the vision. And then she finally approaches this rocky cliff where there's an eagle flying overhead, landing near her. When Orwell tells the eagle her name, the eagle says she's not the one he came here to help. But then Orwell finds she's not holding a bowl, she's holding a book. She realizes the book she's holding is her complaint against the gods. The eagle then says, "Oh, we were expecting you." And he asks her to follow him into the court of the gods to give her complaint. Then countless figures emerge from the rocks of the mountainous cliffs, and they usher her into a hole below the cliffs. She finds herself standing on a pillar in a vast, dark cave. Countless rows of ghostly figures are assembled around her. Standing before her is this veiled judge who orders her to have her veil and all of her clothes removed. And then she's commanded to give her complaint against the gods. But when she opens the book, she realizes it's not the book she had written. Orwell says the real gods are worse than Ungit. In these new words of the book, they says the gods are worse than Ungit. They don't devour, they steal the hearts of our best ones. Orwell would rather that Psyche was killed than remain alive and not have all her affection for herself. Orwell says, "Psyche was mine. You took her from me." At that point, the judge stops her because Orwell realizes she's been reading the same book at least a dozen times. Then Orwell realizes she's speaking in a different voice now. It's her true voice. And she says these words, "I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly, nor let us answer. Till that word can be dug out of us, why should they hear the babble that we think we mean? How can they meet us face to face till we have faces?" At this point, the fox comes to her and leads her out so that she can now be judged by the gods. And they walk into this large gallery where there are paintings on the wall, but these are paintings of Psyche. Psyche undertaking these various tasks that have been given to her. But she also realizes from the paintings, she, Orwell, has been helping Psyche all along. She has been bearing the grief and sorrow of Psyche this entire time. At this point, the fox takes Orwell into a grassy courtyard where she is finally reunited with her sister Psyche face to face. Orwell is told that the god is now coming to judge her. Psyche takes Orwell to a pool, and they look into the reflection of the pool. And Orwell at this point realizes that she loves Psyche now more than ever, but she also realizes that now, for the first time, she loves the god. And she realizes that all of her loves on earth were only for the sake of loving this god who is now coming. They look into the pool and they see their reflection, but now Orwell also looks like Psyche. And she hears the voice of a god saying to her, "You are now Psyche." Orwell now wakes up from her vision in her palace garden, and she dies as she's writing the final paragraph of her book. And then the book ends with a transcript written by the priest of Ungit who says, "If any Greek foreigner comes to visit the kingdom of Glome, please take this book back with you to Greece so that the world might know this story." That went a long time. I'm sorry. There's a lot of questions you might have. There might be some points in there that were confusing, but we're going to talk about that next time. So thank you. Let me pray for us, and then we can go to worship. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this class. And I pray, Lord, that you would give us understanding as we try to learn the truths expressed by our brother C.S. Lewis in this book. We thank you for this time that we have together, and we thank you for this opportunity we now have to worship you. So we love you, Lord, and give you the glory. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.